And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for Sunday morning. We've got some IFR here over the southeastern Bering Sea. Otherwise, IFR also along the Alaska Peninsula on into Shelikof Strait. The remainder of the Aleutians and the Bering Sea. Marginal VFR. Getting some VFR here up over the northern Bering, St. Lawrence Island into the interior and north through the Chukchi Sea into the Arctic Ocean. Marginal VFR here developing along the north slope up to the Brooks Range. IFR here across south central Alaska. Prince William Sound westward to the Alaska Range with marginal VFR and a little bit of IFR here for the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. And then for the afternoon hours, marginal VFR continues for the southeast coast with IFR to the north. IFR here, Gulf of Alaska, right on up into Prince William Sound. And VFR, Susitna Valley, most of Cook Inlet, narrow band of IFR along the western Alaska Range, and some IFR now developing over the Brooks Range with marginal VFR. Looks like it's on the increase for the north slope out to the central and especially the eastern Arctic coast. Still have some IFR here off the southwest coast. Otherwise, marginal VFR for the Aleutians and the Bering Sea. And then for Monday morning, IFR here, southeastern Bering Sea down to the Alaska Peninsula with a band extending up across, along the Aleutian Range into the western Alaska Range. VFR to the north here. More IFR for the north slope, now over the Yukon Flats area down to Eagle, even south of there. But for the most part, Tanana Valley staying VFR. Marginal VFR up into areas of the Copper River Basin with IFR. Western Prince William Sound, eastern Kenai Peninsula, and then mostly off the North Gulf Coast there. Continued marginal over the southeast coast. And looking at the afternoon, no change really out here to the west. And the interior, a lot of marginal VFR now with IFR again along the Alaska Range. And IFR even more widespread here over the northeast interior into the north slope with a narrow band of IFR now along the North Gulf Coast, mostly in the Coast Range there and across the Panhandle, and then on down along the border. And for the passes, Anaktuvuk, VFR, this deterioration in conditions for both Anaktuvuk and Adigan throughout the day, probably becoming IFR at some point Sunday. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR at times, especially on the eastern entrance. Same thing for Rainy. IFR, east side, and for Windy, call it marginal there. Same thing for Isabel, marginal VFR for Sunday. Mentasta, VFR. And Tanita could be IFR day tomorrow. And Portage, also an IFR day coming up there. And for Chilkoot and White, same forecast, IFR. And from there, looking at the freezing levels, continued south and southeast flow pulling 2,000 feet now right up into the interior here, all the way out to the Kuskokwim Delta and Kodiak Island area with that, the surface also almost up to the Alaska Range here. And for tomorrow morning, the surface will be up to St. Matthew Island. From there, looking at icing, again, a lot of moisture. That southeast flow continues to bring a chance of icing here. Southeast coast in across the North Gulf Coast, back down toward northern Kodiak Island with possible considerable moderate rime icing here. Cape St. Elias into Prince William Sound, southern Kenai Peninsula there, in toward or just south of Kamishak Bay. And from there, taking a look at the jet stream. Again, southeast flow here, 75 to 80 knots, up to 95 knots there over the southern Panhandle. Southeast 65 knots out along the North Gulf Coast, and then westerlies at about 70 knots there over the North Slope area. And then stronger winds out here from the northwest, 90 knots cutting across the western Aleutians. 3,000 feet, low pressure here just north of the Fox Islands. Easterlies 40 knots on the north side of that, the west side north to northwest 40 to 50 knots. Southeast flow here in across much of southern Alaska, anywhere from 40 to 50 knots, 40 to 60 knot winds there across the southeast coast, and down to 3,000 feet. Again, frontal boundary right through this area, and that's where the strongest winds are, up to 70 knots there coming into Dixon Entrance. Otherwise, 60-knot winds, looks like for the most part remaining just off the North Gulf Coast there, but blowing into the southern Kenai Peninsula. And then northeast winds here picking up, strongest here over toward Russia up to 85 knots, 40 knots there over the northwest interior areas. Easterlies about 30 knots there just off the southwest coast, turning back around to the north and northwest at 45 to 50 knots here around Atka Island with lighter winds farther to the west. And then for the turbulence, quite an area here of considerable amount of turbulence in the forecast. Southeast coast, North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula down to Kodiak Island, the southwest interior, as well as up here over the western Brooks Range, Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island area, then on the lee side or south side of the Brooks Range there. And also for the mainly from Atka Island into Nikolsky.